The story of Jesus' question to his disciples in Mark 8:27, "Who do people say that I am?" followed by Peter's response and Jesus' first passion prediction and Peter's reaction to that and Jesus' reaction to Peter's reaction and then Jesus' stern admonition to his disciples about the cost of following him is, as a professor of mine said many years ago in a seminary Bible class, the great climactic moment in Mark's gospel. Everything up to this point, everything up to this story has been dealing with the ever-building question of who is this Jesus? The gospel up to this point has shown shown stories of Jesus' preaching and teaching, his miracles, the exorcisms he performed, his growing following of disciples, as well as the growing opposition to him from the Jewish leaders. And more, the controversy surrounding Jesus has been growing and intensifying. People want to know who this Jesus of Nazareth was and what he was all about. Earlier in chapter 8, the Pharisees asked Jesus for a sign from heaven to prove who he was. They were testing him, trying to get him to say something they could use against him, something that might trip him up and be evidence against him in some future trial. But Jesus refused to give such a sign. That's followed by Jesus healing a blind man in the city of Bethsaida. Then, a short time later, he asked his disciples that fateful question, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter's response, "You are the Messiah." What a great thing. But his response was met by Jesus ordering his disciples not to tell anyone that truth. The exact same thing happened after the Transfiguration, just a few verses later. The announcement of who Jesus really was met with a command for silence. It was also met with Jesus' stark announcement of what was about to happen to him. He told them quite plainly, we are told, that what was going to happen when he arrived in Jerusalem. For Jesus had started his journey there. He told his disciples that he would undergo great sufferings. He would be rejected by the Jewish leaders, the chief priests and the scribes, all the leaders of his faith. He would be killed, and then, 3 days later, he would be raised again. I am sure the mouths of the disciples were wide open when he said that. Eyes bugged out, jaws hanging down. They could not believe what he had just said. But then good old Peter came to the rescue. He actually took Jesus aside. I can see him grabbing Jesus by the arm and dragging him away from the rest of the disciples. He took Jesus aside and he began to rebuke him, yelling at him about how he could be so foolish. He wasn't going to die. Hadn't Peter just declared him the Messiah? Messiahs don't die. They're saviors. They're deliverers. But Jesus would have none of it. Turning to the rest of the disciples and speaking in a tone they could all hear and understand, it was his turn to rebuke Peter. And the word in Greek for rebuking is the same one Peter used. Both Jesus and Peter rebuke each other equally. Turnabout is fair play, I guess. Jesus called Peter Satan. Satan. I mean, the same Satan who had tempted Jesus in last week's gospel. Jesus told him that he was setting his mind on earthly things and not the divine. And Peter must have been stunned, flabbergasted. I mean, how could this be? Three times in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus told his disciples what was going to happen to him when he got to Jerusalem. One story is in Mark chapter 8, one's in Mark chapter 9, and one is in Mark chapter 10. 3 times he laid out his coming suffering, rejection, death, and resurrection. Jesus was very clear about it all. And interestingly, each time Jesus did this, that story was followed by another story about Jesus' disciples not understanding what he was talking about. They were clueless. In this week's gospel, Peter gets it all wrong and yells at Jesus. In chapter 9, the disciples don't understand what he's saying, but they're afraid to ask him what he was talking about. And in chapter 10, the last of these passion prediction stories, Jesus' words of self-sacrifice resulted in James and John coming to him seeking personal fame and fortune. I want to sit at your right hand. I want to sit at your left. It is no wonder that each of these stories resulted in Jesus having to tell his disciples what true discipleship meant. If any want to become my followers, he said, Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. He talked about losing your life to save it and not being ashamed of him. Jesus did not mince words. His was serious, life-saving, world-changing business. And after this story, Jesus begins the journey to Jerusalem. He would arrive there at the beginning of chapter 11, right after another healing of a blind man, this time in the city of Jericho. And from there on, from Palm Sunday on, the words Jesus spoke to his disciples on those 3 occasions came true in just a matter of days. He was rejected, he suffered, he was killed, and he was raised. This week's gospel sets the stage for all that is to come.